The light in September over the Harmon County wheat fields came down sideways and turned everything the color of old brass. Elias Whitfield had been watching that light for 68 years, and he could read it the way some men read newspapers, with a kind of intimate familiarity that made the act seem less like observation and more like conversation. He stood at the kitchen window on the morning of September 22, 1982, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, and he watched the horizon to the southwest. It was a Tuesday. The wheat had been ready for 3 days now, the heads hanging heavy and full in the still air, the stalks that burnished amber color that meant the moisture content was just about right. A grain elevator man from Coldwater had driven out to look at the field the week before and said it was some of the finest hard red winter wheat he'd seen in years, and Elias had nodded without saying much, because that was his way, and because he had known it already. The farm was 640 acres, a full section, the same section his father Gus Whitfield had bought in 1921 for $12 an acre with money he'd saved working in the oil fields down in Borger. Gus had broken that ground himself with a pair of Belgian draft horses named Lincoln and Douglas, which Elias had always privately found funny, though he'd never said so. He had grown up on that land. He had buried his wife, Clara, on the far corner of it, under the single cottonwood tree that grew near the stock tank, in 1974. He had worked every inch of it for 40 years, and now his grandson Jimmy worked it, and Elias was officially retired, which meant he got up at 5 every morning instead of 4:30 and was technically not supposed to lift anything heavier than 30 pounds, according to the county doctor. He set the coffee cup down on the counter without drinking from it and walked out onto the porch. The air was different this morning. Still warm. It had been an unseasonably warm September, but there was something underneath the warmth, a kind of pressure, a held breath in the atmosphere that Elias recognized the way a man recognizes the step of a particular horse. He'd felt that pressure before. His father had called it weather comin' loaded, meaning not just rain but the kind of sustained, ground-soaking rainfall that turned wheat fields to mush and knocked ripe grain off the stalk and left it rotting in place. He looked at the sky to the southwest again, copper at the edges. The clouds that had been building yesterday afternoon over toward the Oklahoma panhandle had grown during the night, stacking themselves up in dark and heavy columns. There was no wind yet, which was itself a kind of warning. The meadowlarks that usually sang in the field margins after sunrise were quiet. Elias took a slow breath through his nose. He could smell it. Faintly, still a long way off, but there, the particular damp iron smell of a serious storm system moving across the high plains. He walked back inside, picked up the telephone receiver, and dialed the number of KFDI radio in Wichita. He didn't wait for the disc jockey to finish talking about some song. He listened past it, patient, until the weather came on. The forecaster's voice was smooth and professional, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who worked in an air-conditioned building and had never had anything actually depend on what he was saying. A strong low-pressure system currently centered over southeastern Colorado is expected to bring significant rainfall to southwestern Kansas beginning late Thursday, with the heaviest precipitation anticipated Thursday night into Friday morning. Rainfall totals could reach 3 to 5 inches in some areas, with the potential for localized flooding in low-lying farm fields. Elias hung up the phone. Thursday. That was 48 hours. Maybe a little less, depending on how fast the system was moving, and looking at those clouds, he thought it was moving faster than the radio man believed. 640 acres of wheat that needed to come in. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table and waited for Jimmy to wake up. James Harlan Whitfield. Jimmy was 23 years old and had grown up on this same land, though you'd have had some trouble proving it by the way he sometimes talked about farming. He talked about it like it was an industry, a sector, something with metrics and throughput and optimized input costs. He'd done a year and a half at Kansas State before the money ran out, and he'd come home to work the place full-time after Elias's back had given out in the spring of 1980. He was a good kid. Elias believed that fully and without reservation. He was earnest and hardworking, and he loved the land, even if he sometimes showed it in ways that Elias didn't entirely recognize. It was the machine that was the problem. Back in March of '82, Jimmy had driven down to the International Harvester dealership in Liberal, with the big red and black banners out front and a yard full of gleaming equipment. and he had come back 3 hours later with a signed purchase agreement for a 1982 International Harvester 1460 axial flow combine. The price was $119,800. Call it $120,000. Elias had been sitting on the porch when Jimmy pulled in with that purchase agreement, and he remembered distinctly the feeling that passed through him when Jimmy laid the paperwork on the porch railing. Not anger, not quite fear, something in between, something with a cold edge to it, like touching a fence post in January. Interest rates 18.5%, Elias said, not looking up from the paper. 17.9, Jimmy said. I negotiated. Elias didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the amortization schedule, did the arithmetic in his head the way his father had taught him, carrying figures across columns without a pencil. He arrived at a monthly payment that made something clench in his chest. Dale Whitmore helped me work out the financing, Jimmy said. Dale Whitmore was the sales manager at the IH dealership. He was 40 years old and wore a BOLO tie and drove a 1981 Buick Riviera and had never, to Elias's knowledge, operated any piece of farm equipment larger than a riding lawnmower, though he was extraordinarily knowledgeable about financing terms and extended warranty packages. I'll bet he did, Elias said. Grandpa, this machine. Jimmy sat down on the porch steps, unable to contain his enthusiasm, the words coming fast the way they always did when he was excited. It's got a 255 horsepower engine. It's got an axial flow threshing system. It's going to cut our harvest time in half, maybe better. It's got sensors. It's got a yield monitor. What kind of sensors? Electronic sensors. They monitor the grain loss, the cylinder speed, the moisture content. Everything's automatic. It's basically got a computer right in the cab. Elias was quiet for a long moment. He looked out across the field, where the winter wheat was just beginning to green up after the spring rains. He thought about his father breaking that ground with Lincoln and Douglas. He thought about the John Deere Model D he'd run through the 40s, the old pull-type combine they'd used all through the 50s, the gravity wagon still in the barn with the bent corner from where he'd pulled it too sharp turning at the end of a row in 1963. Son, he said finally, a machine that needs a sensor to tell you what's happening in your own field. Grandpa, I'm not saying don't do it. Elias folded the purchase agreement carefully and set it on the railing. I'm just saying, you know what doesn't need a sensor? Your eyes, your nose. 30 years of doing the same thing. Jimmy had smiled the gentle smile of a young man who loves his grandfather but believes, with the absolute certainty of youth, that the world his grandfather understands is a fundamentally different world from the one he himself is navigating. Times are changing, he said. And Elias, who had heard that phrase approximately 300 times in the last 20 years, nodded once and said nothing more. The machine arrived in late May on a flatbed trailer, and it was, Elias would privately admit, an impressive piece of equipment. Enormous, red and white, with the IH logo on the side and a cab that sat up high with a tinted glass door and a padded seat and an air conditioning unit and an AM/FM radio. The header alone was 15 feet wide. It sat in the yard and gleamed in the late spring sun, and Jimmy walked around it with the expression of a young man who has received exactly what he wanted for Christmas, and several of the neighbors came by to look at it, and Earl Biggs from the next section overshook his head and said, Son, that's a hell of a note, which around there could mean almost anything. Elias looked at it for a long while that first evening. He walked around it slowly, hands in the pockets of his overalls. He looked at the wiring harnesses running along the frame, the sensor units mounted near the threshing cylinder, the little control panel in the cab with its digital readouts. He put his hand flat against the side of the machine, feeling the metal, the way you'd put your hand on a horse's flank to take its measure. Then he went back to the barn. In the far corner of the barn, under 2 tarps and 15 years of accumulated dust and shadow, sat the 1955 Allis-Chalmers WD-45 tractor and the pull-type Allis-Chalmers all-crop 100 harvester that had been hitched to it since approximately 1968. The all-crop had last run in the harvest of 1967. Elias remembered the year clearly because that was the year Clara had broken her ankle and he'd had to do the whole harvest with just his hired man, Dolph Metzger, who was in his 70s even then and moved like a man carrying something heavy. After 1967, the new John Deere self-propelled had come in, and the old all-crop had been relegated to the barn, but Elias had maintained it, serviced it every spring. Changed the oil in the WD-45, checked the belts and chains on the harvester, kept the cutting components sharp and properly set. Jimmy had asked about it once, 2 years ago, looking at the two tarps in the corner. What's under there? Old combine setup, Elias said. Should we sell it? No. Jimmy had accepted this the way he accepted many of his grandfather's positions, without full understanding, but with a recognition that the old man usually had a reason, even when that reason was not immediately apparent. Standing in the barn that May evening, looking at the shapes under the tarps, Elias thought about the sensor units on the new machine. He thought about the way electronics behaved in Kansas in August and September, the heat, the dust, the vibration of a combine working at full capacity in a field, the static electricity that built up in dry grain. He thought about the fact that it was not the first time farming had gone high-tech. He had watched the diesel tractor replace the horse. He had watched the self-propelled combine replace the pull type. He had watched the chemical fertilizers come in, the hybrid seed varieties, the center pivot irrigation. Every generation had its new thing that was going to change everything. Some of them did change everything. And some of them broke down 60 miles from the nearest parts depot at the worst possible moment. He pulled the tarp back from the front of the WD-45 and looked at the orange paint, still reasonably bright in the dim barn light. He checked the oil. He made a note to himself to service it before fall, just in case. The thing about farming that people who don't farm never quite understand is that every decision has a cost structure that extends backward and forward in time simultaneously. The cost of being wrong about the weather on Thursday is priced not just in the damage of Thursday, but in the debt you're already carrying from last March, and the obligation you have to the bank that holds your note, and the promise implicit in the seeds you put in the ground 6 months ago, and the memory of your father standing in a field just like this one, looking at a sky just like this one, making a decision that you either proved right or wrong over the following 50 years of your life. Elias understood this arithmetic the way he understood the mechanics of a clutch or the signs of armorworm in a wheat field, not as abstract knowledge, but as lived, physical understanding, encoded in his body over decades of practice. He was thinking about it as he sat at the kitchen table waiting for Jimmy to come downstairs, listening to the coffee percolate on the stove, a Mr. Coffee machine that Jimmy had bought at the Duckwalls in Mead last Christmas, and which Elias used every morning while privately preferring the old percolator that had sat on this same stove since 1952. And he was still thinking about it when he heard Jimmy's boots on the stairs. Jimmy came into the kitchen in his jeans and flannel shirt, his dark hair still unsettled from sleep, and poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the counter looking out the window at the fields. "Morning," he said. "You need to get the combine running today," Elias said. "Start this morning. Work through until you can't see." Jimmy turned and looked at him. Elias was not a man who offered instructions without cause, hadn't been for years, had been careful to step back and let Jimmy run the operation, offering opinions only when asked. The directness of it registered immediately. "Weather," Jimmy said. "Thursday. Maybe sooner. KFDI saying 3 to 5 inches. Jimmy set his coffee cup down and walked to the kitchen door and looked out at the sky to the southwest. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a lot of acres." "Yes, it is." Jimmy looked at his grandfather. "The new combine can do it. 15-foot header. I can run 100 acres a day, easy in good conditions." "Then you better start this morning," Elias said. The 1982 International Harvester 1460 axial flow combine had been sitting in the machine shed since August, when Jimmy had done his pre-harvest inspection and servicing. He had followed the dealer's recommended service protocol to the letter, changed the hydraulic fluid, checked all the belts, inspected the concave clearance, calibrated the cleaning shoe. He had done everything right. He was a careful young man. At 7:14 in the morning on September 22, 1982, he climbed up into the cab, settled into the padded seat, adjusted the air conditioning vent out of habit even though the morning was cool enough that he didn't need it, and turned the key. The engine turned over. The 466 cubic inch diesel caught, grumbled, smoothed out into its characteristic deep idle. The digital display panel on the dash lit up. The amber and green lights of the monitoring system blinked on in sequence, running their startup check. And then one of those lights stayed on. Solid. Amber. Jimmy leaned forward and looked at it. The light was labeled, in small stenciled letters, threshing monitor/cylinder sensor. He'd seen the light before, briefly, when he first started the machine in the spring. It had gone off after a minute. He waited for it to go off now. It didn't. He ran through the startup sequence in the operator's manual that he had read twice through and kept in the cab. The manual had a troubleshooting section for the monitoring system that ran to 11 pages and was written in the careful, hedging language of engineers who know that the people reading their words are going to be angry when they read them. He followed the prescribed steps. He checked the sensor connection at the cylinder housing, accessible through a small panel on the right side of the combine. The connector looked fine. He restarted the machine. The amber light stayed on. He tried engaging the threshing cylinder. The cylinder engaged. He could hear it turning, could feel the vibration through the machine, but the digital speed readout on the monitor panel showed nothing. 0. And when he drove the combine to the edge of the field and lowered the header and tried to make one pass, the machine made a sound. Not a catastrophic sound, not a grinding or a bang, but a kind of hesitation, a digital hiccup, and an alarm began beeping from the panel, and a second light came on, this one red, and the machine automatically disengaged the threshing cylinder as a safety measure. The IH1460 would not harvest grain, with its monitoring system indicating a sensor fault. The engineering team that designed it in the late 1970s had built in a failsafe that prevented operation when the electronic monitoring system detected a malfunction to protect the machine from damage. It was a thoughtful design feature that, in the context of a wheat field in southwestern Kansas with 48 hours until a major storm system, felt less like a safety feature and more like a hostage situation. Jimmy sat in the cab for a long moment with his hands on his knees. Then he got down and walked back to the house. Dale Whitmore arrived at the Whitfield farm at 11 o'clock that morning in his 1981 Buick Riviera, which he kept clean enough that Elias always thought, when he saw it turning up the drive, that it looked like a car that had never driven on a gravel road before and found the experience deeply distressing. Whitmore was 40 years old and looked like a man who had made a calculation early in his career that appearance was capital and had invested accordingly. He wore a pressed sport coat over a checkered shirt, the bolo tie with the turquoise slide, and boots that had been cleaned that morning. He shook Jimmy's hand in the yard and gave Elias a nod and went to look at the combine. He spent 20 minutes inside the cab with the operator's manual and another 10 walking around the machine, looking at things without touching them, the way a man looks at something when he doesn't want to pick it up. Then he came back to where Jimmy and Elias were standing by the machine shed. "It's the microprocessor unit," Whitmore said. "The sensor itself is probably fine. What you've got is the logic board in the monitoring system, the chip that processes the signal from the cylinder sensor. I've seen it once or twice before." He said this last sentence in the tone of a doctor who says, "I've seen this before," meaning not, "I know how to fix it," but rather, "I know what's wrong and I can tell you with authority that there is nothing we can do today." "Can you fix it?" Jimmy asked. "Not here. The logic board for the monitoring system. It's not a part we stock. It's manufactured by Motorola, out of state. I'd have to order it through our parts system." "How long?" Whitmore adjusted his bolo tie. 2 weeks, maybe. Could be closer to 3. Parts have been slow since IH started having their difficulties. He was referring, with tactful understatement, to the fact that International Harvester had been having severe financial problems for the past year. Was, in fact, in the process of restructuring and would eventually sell off its entire agricultural division. None of them knew that in September 1982, but Whitmore was aware that IH's supply chain was in serious trouble, and 2 to 3 weeks may have been optimistic. Jimmy stood very still. Elias noticed this, the stillness, which was different from the stillness of a calm man. It was the stillness of a man holding himself together through an act of will. "There's a storm coming Thursday," Jimmy said. "I've got 640 acres of wheat on the ground." "I understand that," Whitmore said. He nodded several times, with the expression of a man who understands something in the sense of being able to identify it as a category of human experience that other people have, not in the sense of having felt it himself. "I wish I had better news. I can put a rush on the order, see if we can get it in under 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Jimmy said. He was not really talking to Whitmore. He was computing something, working through numbers in the way Elias recognized, the same arithmetic any farmer ran in his head in any season when the stakes became visible. At 18% interest, with this note, if I lose this crop. He stopped. Now there may be something else we can do in the interim, Whitmore said, and reached into the breast pocket of his sport coat and produced a folded page from what appeared to be a parts catalog. We have an aftermarket bypass module. It's not standard equipment. It's something a supplier out of Oklahoma puts together. It doesn't fix the monitoring system, but it lets the machine run without the cylinder sensor active. It's about $400, and I want to be honest with you, Jimmy. It voids the extended warranty on the monitoring system, but in an emergency situation. Does it work? Jimmy said. Whitmore's expression shifted very slightly. It's worked in other cases. I can't guarantee it. There have been instances where it's caused secondary issues with the. In other words, it might just cause a different problem, Elias said. Both men looked at him. Elias had been standing with his thumbs hooked in the straps of his overalls, looking at the combine, not particularly at anyone. He said this without inflection, as if he were simply restating information that had already been provided. Whitmore looked back at Jimmy. I want to be transparent with you. It's an option, but it comes with uncertainty. $400 for an aftermarket module that might create a different problem. 2 weeks for the real part, with a storm arriving in 2 days. 18.5% annual interest on a $120,000 note. 640 acres of ripe wheat. Elias did the math. He'd been doing the math since the morning, really, and the answer came out the same every time. He turned and walked toward the barn without saying anything. Where's he going? He heard Whitmore say behind him. I don't know, Jimmy said, and there was a new quality in his voice. Uncertainty, the first real crack in the morning's composure. He does that. The barn smelled the way it had smelled for as long as Elias could remember. Machine oil, and old wood, and the ghost of hay, and the particular dry, dusty smell of a Kansas building that has absorbed 40 years of summer heat. The light came in through the gaps in the siding in long strips, moving with the slight shifting of the boards in the breeze, and the dust moved in those strips of light, like something slow and patient and undemanding. Elias walked past the tool bench his father had built, still solid after 60 years, past the hanging harness that he'd never quite been able to bring himself to throw away even decades after the last horse left, past the row of oil cans and the coiled chains and the spare parts bins that held a lifetime's accumulation of bearings and bolts and belts and the particular miscellany of a working farm. He went to the far corner of the barn and took hold of the first tarp. The Allis-Chalmers WD-45 came out from under it the way an old dog comes out from under a porch when called. Familiar, unhurried, completely present. The orange paint was faded to the color of old brick in places, but the sheet metal was straight and the tires, both front and rear, held their air because Elias topped them up every spring. He'd put new valve stems in the spring of 1979. The engine had been rebuilt by a machinist in Coldwater in 1971, and Elias had not abused it since. He checked the oil dipstick. The oil was dark, but not black, still in the acceptable range. He checked the radiator with a rag on the cap. He took the second tarp off the All-Crop 100. The harvester was orange as well, with the Allis-Chalmers name in white letters on the grain tank. It was a pull-type unit, meaning it ran off the power takeoff shaft of the tractor rather than having its own engine, and it was entirely, completely, 100% mechanical in its operation. No electronics. No sensors. No logic boards manufactured by Motorola. It had a sickle bar for cutting, a reel for gathering, a cylinder and concave for threshing, a cleaning shoe with sieves and a fan for separating grain from chaff, an auger for moving grain to the tank. All of it driven by belts and chains and gears off a single PTO shaft. The physics of the thing had not changed since grain was first harvested by machine. Centrifugal force, airflow, gravity, the geometry of threshing. Elias walked around it, running his hands over the frame. He checked the sickle bar sections, a couple needed replacing, and he had sections in the parts bin. He checked the drive belts. The main drive belt was cracked and would need to come off. He had a spare, still in its original packaging, that he'd bought in 1974 and never used. He checked the cylinder clearance. He checked the grain tank auger for wear. He knelt down and looked underneath at the cleaning shoe, moving the sieves by hand to check their action. It would take most of the afternoon to get it ready, but it would run. He went back to the yard where Jimmy and Whitmore were still talking. Jimmy looked up when he saw his grandfather coming, and something in the old man's walk, That particular deliberate, unhurried quality that Elias had in his stride when he had made up his mind about something made Jimmy go quiet in the middle of a sentence. "Jimmy," Elias said, "I'm going to need your help in the barn." Whitmore looked from one to the other. "I can leave the information about the bypass module." "Thank you for coming," Elias said. He said it pleasantly, without edge, which somehow made it more final than if he'd said it sharply. He looked at Whitmore with a kind of level, unhurried regard. The look of a man who has dealt with other men his entire life and has long since learned the difference between a man who is helpful and a man who is selling something. And Whitmore, who was perceptive enough to recognize what he was looking at, folded up his catalog page and put it back in his pocket. "Call me if you change your mind," Whitmore said. Jimmy watched the Riviera go down the drive and turn onto the county road. Then he looked at his grandfather. "What's in the barn?" he said. "Your harvest," Elias said. Jimmy stood in the barn doorway looking at the 1955 Allis-Chalmers setup with an expression that Elias recognized. He'd seen it on Jimmy's face once before, when the boy was about 6 years old and had been told there would be no Christmas tree that year because money was short, and had taken a moment to absorb this information before deciding how to respond to it. "That's 30 years old," Jimmy said. 27, Elias said. "Built in 55. I bought it new." "It doesn't have," Jimmy stopped. Started again. "That header's only 10 feet. 8 feet, Elias said. "But it'll cut clean in wheat like yours." Jimmy turned and looked out through the barn door at the 1460 sitting in the machine shed, silent, its monitoring system holding it prisoner, the amber warning light almost certainly still glowing in the empty cab. "The payments," he said quietly. "If I miss this harvest." "Then don't miss it," Elias said. He was already at the parts bin, pulling out a set of sickle bar sections and a new main drive belt still in its original waxed paper packaging. "Hand me that 3/8 wrench. The offset one." Jimmy found the wrench without being asked. He'd grown up in this barn, knew where things were in the same cellular, pre-verbal way he knew the layout of the farmhouse, and handed it to his grandfather. They worked through the afternoon without much conversation, because that was the Whitfield way and also because the work required attention. Elias replaced the sickle bar sections, sharpening the new ones on the bench grinder as he installed them. Jimmy changed the drive belt, skinning his knuckle on the upper sheave and cursing under his breath, and then checking that Elias hadn't heard him, and then catching Elias's barely suppressed expression and understanding that he had. Elias adjusted the cylinder clearance, measuring it with a gauge he'd made himself from a piece of sheet metal cut to the right thickness, a tool that had no official name, was not in any manual, but had worked reliably for 27 years. He checked the sieve settings and adjusted the fan speed on the cleaning shoe. Around 2 in the afternoon, Jimmy went inside and came back with sandwiches and 2 bottles of Pepsi, and they sat on an overturned bucket and a nail keg and ate without talking, looking at the machine. "Grandpa," Jimmy said finally, "this thing hasn't run since." 67, Elias said. 15 years. "What if it doesn't start?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He chewed his sandwich, bologna and mustard, Clara's recipe, which meant Jimmy had made it the same way she always did, which Elias noticed but didn't mention. He looked at the WD-45 tractor. He had serviced it in the spring, as he did every spring. Oil change, new fuel filter, checked the points and timing, ran it around the yard for 20 minutes to keep the seals from hardening. He had done this every spring for 15 years, not because he knew he would need it, not exactly, but because his father had taught him that the cost of maintaining something you might need was almost always less than the cost of not maintaining something you turn out to desperately need. "It'll start," he said. He put fresh fuel in the tank from the farm diesel supply. He primed the fuel system. He checked the battery. The battery was the one uncertainty. It was a spring service battery, but it had been sitting in the corner of a barn through a Kansas summer. He connected the battery cables and watched the voltage on the ammeter needle swing and hold. Then he climbed up onto the tractor seat, the simple steel seat, no padding, no air conditioning, no radio, no digital readout of any kind, set the throttle and the choke, and turned the key. The WD-45 cranked, turned over again. And on the third turn it caught, first with a bark, then with a rattle that smoothed and deepened into the steady beat of a healthy diesel engine running on direct injection, a sound Elias felt in his chest and in the soles of his feet through the metal of the tractor frame. He sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel and listened to the engine run. Then he looked down at Jimmy, who was standing next to the machine looking up at him, and something had changed in Jimmy's face. The tightness around the eyes, the controlled composure of a man holding something back. It was not gone, but it had acquired something new. He looked, Elias thought, like a young man who has just been reminded that there are things in the world older and steadier than his current fear. "Hook her up," Elias said. They drove the rig out of the barn at 4 in the afternoon. The orange WD-45 with the orange all-crop 100 trailing behind it, the chains and belts of the harvester running off the PTO shaft, the whole assembly moving across the yard with that particular unstoppable deliberateness of a machine that has no sensors to fail and no logic boards to malfunction and no microchips on backorder from another state. The neighbors saw it. Earl Biggs, driving past on the county road, slowed his truck to a stop and looked. Two of the Sandoval brothers from the south section, running their own combines on their own wheat ground, stopped their machines at the edge of their field and watched. Word went out the way word does in farming communities, which is to say instantly and completely, and through no mechanism that can be clearly identified, by telephone party line, maybe, or simply by the organic transmission network of people who watch their neighbors' fields the way they watch their own, which in a farming community is the same thing. Elias pulled to the edge of the first field and stopped the tractor. He climbed down and walked the header along the edge of the standing wheat, checking the lay of the crop, how the stalks were positioned relative to the direction of travel. The wheat was standing well, a good crop, ripe and full, the heads bending under their own weight. He noted the direction of the slight breeze, because you always wanted to cut with or slightly against the grain's natural lean, and he noted the moisture in the air, which was still low but rising steadily. He climbed back up on the tractor. "You ride with me," he told Jimmy. "Watch the header. Watch the ground speed. I'll tell you what to look for." "There's no cab," Jimmy said. There was no complaint in his voice. He was simply identifying a fact he appeared to find noteworthy after several months of operating a machine with air conditioning and a padded seat and an FM radio. "No," Elias agreed. He put the tractor in gear and let the clutch out and drove into the wheat. The first thing that struck Jimmy, standing on the narrow platform behind the tractor seat with one hand on the roll bar, was the sound. The 1460 IH had been almost eerily quiet inside its sealed cab. You could hear the engine, muffled and distant, and the dashboard speakers playing KFDI, and occasionally an alarm beeping at you. On the WD-45, you heard everything. You heard the sickle bar cutting through the wheat stalks with a rapid reciprocating sound like a very fast heartbeat, and you heard the reel turning and laying the cut grain back onto the platform. And you heard the cylinder threshing and the fan on the cleaning shoe and the grain moving up the auger into the tank. And underneath all of it you heard the engine and the belt drives and the chain drives. The whole mechanical language of the machine talking to itself and to you. You felt it, too. Every small variation in the ground, every patch of heavier crop, every slight change in terrain transmitted directly through the tractor's chassis into your hands and legs and spine. It was nothing like operating the 1460. It was not comfortable. It was not automated. It required constant attention, watching the header height, watching the crop as it went in, listening for sounds that indicated a problem, feeling the power demand through the tractor's response. But it was not passive, either. You were not monitoring a machine that monitored itself. You were doing the work, and the machine was doing the work, and the two of you were doing it together. And there was something in that, a kind of directness, a transparency of operation, a sense that you understood exactly what was happening and why. That was unlike anything he had experienced climbing into the pressurized, climate-controlled, digitally mediated cab of the 1460. Elias drove with a focus that was not hurry. He was not a hurrying kind of man. But there was nothing wasted, no wide turns, no overlap, the rows clean and tight, the machine working at its full efficient capacity. He read the field the way he had read it for 40 years, adjusting his ground speed for the density of the crop, slowing slightly in the heavier patches and moving at a steady pace through the more open areas, keeping the cylinder from laboring while also keeping it fed. They filled the grain tank for the first time at 6 o'clock. Jimmy drove the grain truck, a 1971 Ford F-600 with a 15-foot grain box, alongside the harvester while they were still moving, and Elias engaged the unloading auger, and the wheat came out in a golden rush, and Jimmy watched it fill the truck box with an expression that was entirely different from the expression he'd had when the 1460s warning light had come on that morning. They ate supper in the field. Jimmy's mother, Patty, who had driven out from town when she heard about the situation, brought food in the truck, pork chops and beans and biscuits wrapped in foil, and coffee in a thermos. They ate sitting on the running board of the grain truck while the WD-45 idled nearby, and the sky to the southwest was doing things that Allis watched with the careful peripheral attention of a man who monitors a wound regularly without making an issue of it. The storm was moving faster than the KFDI forecast had suggested. The clouds that had been building on the southwestern horizon that morning were now a distinct and organized presence, the kind of dark architectural structure that plains people call a weather wall. Not yet overhead, but no longer distant. The anvil tops of the cumulus towers catching the last daylight in a way that turned them the color of old bruises. "How fast is it moving?" Jimmy asked. "Faster than they said," Allis said. Jimmy looked at his watch. It was 7:45 in the evening. He did the arithmetic in his head, the same kind of arithmetic Allis had been doing for decades, that calculus of acres remaining versus time remaining versus equipment capacity versus weather. "We're not going to make it," he said. "Not by daylight." "No," Allis agreed. "Get the lights." The WD-45 had working headlights. Allis had replaced the bulbs in the spring of 1978. And the all-crop had a pair of auxiliary lights mounted on the header that Allis had added back in 1962, when he'd done his first night harvest. They weren't brilliant, but they were adequate, and more importantly, Allis knew this field the way he knew his own face. He knew where the drainage swale ran in the northwest corner. He knew where the slight rise near the east fence would make the crop stand a little lighter. He knew which rows the deer walked and which rows they didn't. He knew the field. They kept going. There is a quality to farm work done at night that people who have never done it cannot quite imagine, and that people who have done it never entirely forget. The darkness compresses the world. The field ceases to have visible edges. It is not a farm field anymore, but simply the ground immediately in front of the machine, caught in the white cone of the headlights, the standing wheat, and then the cut stubble, and then the darkness. And you navigate from one row to the next by feel, and by the memory of where you've been, and by 30 years or 60 years of knowing how flat ground lies. The sounds were louder at night. The engine, the sickle bar, the cylinder, the fan and sieves, all of it rose to fill the absence of the daytime world. The sky to the southwest was illuminated occasionally by lightning, still distant, still without audible thunder, but regular now and brightening. The storm walking toward them across the plains with that slow-seeming but inexorable pace of a serious prairie weather system. Earl Biggs appeared at 10 o'clock. He drove into the field in his own grain truck, the old International with the cracked windshield, and climbed out and stood in the headlights and waved. He didn't say anything for a while. He looked at the WD-45 working the rows in the beam of the auxiliary lights, watched the grain flowing into the tank, watched Allis on the tractor with his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the header. "How much you got left?" he asked Jimmy. "Maybe 250 acres, Jimmy said. He said it without drama. He was past drama. There was only the work and the numbers and the sky. "My combine's sitting," Earl said. "I got mine in 2 days ago." He looked at Jimmy. "I figure I still know how to drive a truck." Half an hour later, the Sandoval brothers arrived. Luis and Marco, in their pickup, with a thermos of coffee from their mother and an offer to run the grain trucks so Jimmy could ride with his grandfather. Then Pete Haugen from the section to the north, who had finished his own harvest early and came because that was what neighbors did in 1982 in Harmon County, Kansas. Then Clarence Ritter, who was 65 and had farmed the land just east of the Whitfields for 40 years and who arrived in his pickup at 11 o'clock and stood watching the old Allis-Chalmers work for a long moment before he got out of the truck. "I'll be damned," Clarence said quietly. "She's running good," Jimmy said. Clarence looked at him. "Your grandfather serviced that thing every year?" "Every spring," Jimmy said. Clarence shook his head slowly, the way men shake their heads when something confirms a belief they've held a long time. He took a cup of coffee from Jimmy and walked to the edge of the headlight beam and watched Allis driving the rig down another row, and he did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. Nobody asked the old man if he wanted them there. Nobody offered help in the way that carries the implication of charity. They just arranged themselves into a working system. Luis Sandoval running the primary grain truck, Marco running the second, Earl Biggs running fuel for the tractor, Pete Haugen loading grain at the elevator turn-off on the county road, Clarence Ritter doing whatever needed doing and talking to no one in particular. Jimmy moved between them, directing, keeping the system flowing. And Elias drove the tractor. He drove it for 6 hours without stopping. He would be asked about this later by the doctor at the Mead Clinic who examined him the following week, and he would say simply that he drove it because there was driving to be done. The doctor would say something about a 68-year-old man sitting on an unpadded tractor seat for 6 consecutive hours being remarkable, and Elias would say that a 68-year-old man who has spent 50 years on a tractor seat has a different relationship to the enterprise than the doctor might suppose. He drove and he thought, in the way you think when work occupies your hands and eyes, but leaves some deeper part of the mind free to move. He thought about his father Gus, who had broken this exact ground with a pair of horses and had lived his whole life working it, and had died in 1958 in the bed he was born in the county where he'd spent his entire life, and had never considered this remarkable. He thought about Clara, who had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse more than once watching the weather come in, her apron still on from whatever she'd been doing inside, with that look of concentrated calm that was her particular version of prayer. He thought about Jimmy, carrying that $120,000 note at 18%, and how that was a weight he himself had never carried but had watched other men carry through the 60s and early 70s, the way debt concentrated a man's attention wonderfully, the way it made every harvest feel like a final examination. He thought about the dealer in the pressed sport coat and the BOLO tie. He thought about the Motorola microchip on order from somewhere in another state. He thought about what it meant that a $120,000 piece of equipment could be rendered completely useless by a component worth perhaps $12 that sat inside a sealed housing and couldn't be fixed in the field and couldn't be bypassed without buying an aftermarket part that might cause a different problem. He thought about the WD-45 under him, idling steady, the cylinders singing in the background, the grain going cleanly over the sieves and up the auger into the tank. No sensors, no logic board, no warning lights or digital displays. Just metal and oil and the physics of separation, centrifugal force, airflow, gravity, the geometry of threshing, the same physics that had separated wheat from chaff for thousands of years, now implemented in orange-painted steel made in a factory in LaPorte, Indiana, in 1955, maintained by a man in Harmon County, Kansas, who had never stopped believing that you service the things you might need, even when you think you might never need them. At 2 in the morning, Jimmy climbed up on the WD-45 platform next to his grandfather. About 100 acres left, he shouted over the engine. Elias nodded without taking his eyes off the header. The storm is. Jimmy looked southwest. The lightning was regular now, and the first low sound of distant thunder had started, intermittent, below the range at which you felt it in your chest rather than heard it with your ears. Maybe 4 hours. Elias did the arithmetic. 100 acres at their current rate. 4 hours. It was tight. He increased the ground speed slightly, not enough to strain the cylinder, but enough to feel. He watched the header, watched the straw going over the back of the machine, looking for signs of grain loss that would indicate he was pushing it too hard. There were none. The old machine took the increase without complaint and kept running, the belts and chains doing exactly what they had been built and maintained to do. He drove on into the night. At 5:40 in the morning, with the eastern horizon beginning to show the first iron-gray light of dawn and the western sky a solid wall of dark cloud shot through regularly with lightning, the last round remaining in the Whitfield wheat fields was about 40 acres. The wind had started an hour ago. It had come in from the southwest in long, steady pushes, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last 2 hours, and the air smelled powerfully now of rain. Not the gentle smell of an afternoon shower, but the deep, mineral, overwhelming smell of heavy precipitation approaching from a distance measured in tens of miles rather than hundreds. The men who had been helping through the night moved with the particular focused silence of people responding to an obvious and immediate urgency. Luis Sandoval was running the grain truck at a pace that had become almost reflexive, pulling alongside when the tank was nearing full, watching the auger's action, moving away and back to the elevator turn-off at the road without needing direction. Earl Biggs was standing by the fuel supply, watching the WD-45's fuel gauge with steady attention. Clarence Ritter had positioned himself at the end of the last section of rows where he could serve as a ground spotter, watching the header, watching the ground ahead for anything that shouldn't be there. Jimmy stood at the edge of the field watching his grandfather. He had been on and off the tractor through the night, spelling Elias occasionally for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, just long enough for the old man to stand up and move and drink a cup of coffee, always returning to the seat before Jimmy had finished a full round. Jimmy had driven the WD-45 in the dark, feeling through the steering wheel and the seat and the balls of his feet the field he had grown up in, and it had been a different experience from anything he had words for yet. He had come back to the seat after one of his breaks and found a depth in his own understanding of the machine that had not been there before, knowledge acquired not from an operator's manual, but from the machine itself, from the way it spoke to you through your hands and your seat and the soles of your feet when you paid attention to it rather than to the display in front of your face. 40 acres. At current pace, approximately an hour. The thunder was audible now. Not distant rumble, but distinct rolling concussions, each one closer than the last. The lightning was bright enough to cast shadows. Elias drove. He did not look at the sky to the southwest, because looking at the sky was not going to harvest any wheat. He looked at the header and the crop in front of it and the ground ahead, and he drove. His hands on the WD-45 steering wheel were not gripping but resting. The grip of a man who has done this long enough that the wheel and his hands are simply parts of the same system, each informing the other without either commanding. His back ached. His knees ached. The seat was steel and the tractor had no suspension, and every small rock and hollow in the field traveled directly through the chassis into the man operating it, and after 6 hours this added up. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a familiar discomfort, present, acknowledged, not in charge. He thought about his father's hands. Gus Whitfield had been a compact, dark-complexioned man with forearms like rolled iron and hands that looked like they had been roughened by a process more industrial than agricultural. He had died with those hands. Elias remembered them at the visitation, how strange they looked, folded and still, hands that in all the years Elias had known them had never been still. His father had been a man who did not talk about farming as a vocation or a calling or a way of life. He talked about it as a set of problems to be solved and obligations to be met, and he had been good at both, and that was all. When things went badly, drought years, the year the chinch bugs came, the year the price of wheat collapsed after the war, he had worked the same way he always worked, which was steadily and without drama, because the work needed doing regardless of what had happened or what might happen. I am my father's work, Elias thought. This field is my father's work. This machine is my father's money, and my hands on it are my father's hands, and the grain in the tank is what all of it was for. He made the last turn at the northwest corner, the corner near the cottonwood, near where Clara lay, at 6:35 in the morning. The last 80 rods of wheat were in front of him, a long straight strip running east. The sky to the southwest was fully dark now, the cloud wall directly overhead, and the rain was visible in the lightning flashes as a gray curtain sweeping across the ground toward them. He felt the first drops on his hands at 6:41. Not rain yet. The leading edge of the system, large, sparse drops, the vanguard of the serious precipitation that was 3 or 4 minutes behind them. He drove faster. The men at the field's edge saw it, saw the old man on the old tractor push the throttle up and lean forward slightly in that steel seat, and the all-crop accelerated with him, the cylinder rising in pitch, the sickle bar working at its maximum comfortable speed, the 8-foot header laying into the last strip of wheat with everything it had. Jimmy stood with his fists clenched in his pockets and watched. The grain tank was nearly full. Earl Biggs had pulled the truck up alongside and engaged the unloading auger so it could run as they moved, the wheat falling in a golden stream into the truck bed even as the first real rain began to come in horizontal on the wind. At 6:47 in the morning, on September 23, 1982, the header of the 1955 Allis-Chalmers All-Crop 100 cleared the last standing wheat on the Whitfield section and ran into clean stubble. The rain hit full force approximately 90 seconds later. Elias shut the tractor down at the edge of the field with the rain hammering on the hood and the men standing around in it. Nobody moving toward shelter, all of them standing in the kind of rain you stand in when the urgency is over and the body has not yet registered that there is no longer any reason to stay where you are. Jimmy walked through the rain to the tractor. He stood next to the WD-45 and looked up at his grandfather sitting on the seat, water running off the brim of his cap and soaking the shoulders of his overalls, and Elias looked down at him. And there was between them for a moment the particular silence that exists when something important has just happened and the words for it have not yet been worked out. "Thank you," Jimmy said. He said it simply, without elaboration, and Elias, who was not a man who required elaboration, nodded once. Clarence Ritter, who had been standing nearby, put his hand briefly on the fender of the WD-45, not a gesture of sentiment, exactly, but something like it. The handshake of one working man for another. Then he walked to his truck. Earl Biggs and the Sandoval brothers drove out, windows down, headlights on, back to their own farms and their own barns. They did not make speeches. Pete Haugen honked once and was gone. Jimmy's mother Patty appeared from the truck cab with a dry towel and pressed it into Elias's hands when he climbed down from the tractor, and Elias took it without ceremony and stood in the rain holding it and looking at the field, which was already invisible under sheets of falling water. They drove the rig back to the barn in the downpour, the WD-45 moving steadily through the storm with the all-crop behind it. When they got to the barn, Elias pulled the rig inside and shut it down and sat on the tractor seat for a moment after the engine died. The barn was loud with rain on the roof. That particular percussion of serious rain on old metal roofing that starts as a roar and you learn not to hear after a while, not because it goes away, but because it becomes the ambient condition of the world, the sound the world makes when the crisis is over and the accounting begins. He climbed down from the tractor and stood looking at it in the barn light. Water was still running off his cap. His knees ached considerably. He put his hand flat against the orange fender, the way he had put his hand against the side of the 1460 that first May evening, and he stood there a moment feeling the warmth the engine had left in the metal. Jimmy was standing in the barn door watching the rain come down on the yard and on the fields, where the new-cut stubble was already disappearing under a sheet of falling water. "All of it," Jimmy said. "Every acre." "Every acre," Elias agreed. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Grandpa, why did you keep it?" "The old machine. You kept servicing it every year, and it's been 15 years since you used it." "What?" Elias looked at the WD-45 for a while. He thought about how to answer this, and then he thought that maybe the simplest answer was the right one. "Because I didn't know when I'd need it," he said. "And your great-grandfather taught me that the things worth having are worth maintaining." Jimmy looked at the machine. Then he looked at his grandfather. Then he looked back out at the rain. "The IH note is $1,730 a month," he said. "At 18%. "I know. The all-crop cost $2,800, Elias said. "In 55 money." Jimmy turned and looked at him. "It's paid for," Elias said. "The wheat came in at 42.7 bushels per acre, a very good yield for hard red winter wheat in Harmon County. The sample weight was excellent, the test weight making grade at the elevator without discount." Dale Whitmore called the following week to say the microprocessor unit for the IH-1460 had arrived ahead of schedule. Only 10 days. Wasn't that good news? And Jimmy told him politely that he would call when he was ready to schedule the repair, and hung up. The IH-1460 sat in the machine shed through October with the amber warning light still glowing in its sealed, climate-controlled cab. The machine that needed a chip waited for the man who didn't need one. The WD-45 and the all-crop 100 went back under their tarps in the corner of the barn, serviced and covered, ready. Elias serviced them every spring for the next 12 years, until arthritis made the close work impractical, at which point Jimmy took over the task. He did it the same way his grandfather had done it. Oil change on the WD-45, check the belts on the harvester, run the tractor for 20 minutes around the yard, top off the fuel. He did it on a schedule, without reference to whether he thought he'd need it. He did it because someone had taught him that you maintain the things worth having. He did it because of a September morning when his grandfather had walked quietly into a barn, pulled a tarp off a 27-year-old machine, and saved everything. In the spring of 1983, interest rates began their long decline from the disastrous highs of the early Reagan years. The farm credit crisis, which would bankrupt hundreds of operations like the Whitfield Place across the Great Plains in the coming years, ground on. But they made it through, barely, on the strength of that September harvest and the discipline and stubbornness that Elias had modeled so completely and so quietly for so long that Jimmy had absorbed it without fully knowing he was being taught. The 1982 harvest made the IH note payments for 6 months. It kept the land in the family. It was possible. It was more than possible. It was simply true that the land remained in the family because a man in worn overalls had spent one afternoon every spring for 15 years maintaining a machine that he might never need. In 1985, the International Harvester Agricultural Division was purchased by Case Corporation. The dealer network restructured. The dealership in Liberal changed its name and its banners. Eventually, Dale Whitmore was transferred to an operation in Amarillo. Nobody at the Whitfield farm noticed his departure, because nobody at the Whitfield farm had been to that dealership since September of 1982. Elias died in 1991 in a hospital in Dodge City of the heart attack that had been coming for 10 years. He was 77 years old. Jimmy was at the hospital. He held his grandfather's hand, those hands that felt like the bark of an old oak tree, thick and furrowed and completely themselves. And he thought about September and the smell of rain coming across the plains and the sound of the WD-45's engine running steady in the dark. At the service, Earl Biggs said that Elias Whitfield was the kind of man you didn't fully appreciate until you needed him, and then you appreciated him more than you had words for. It was, Jimmy thought, exactly right. The farm is still in the family. The WD-45 is still in the barn. The paint is faded to the color of old brick, and the seat is cold steel, and there is no air conditioning and no radio and no digital display of any kind. It is still maintained. Every spring, without fail, whether it is needed that year or not. Some things you keep because you know you will need them. Some things you keep because your grandfather knew. Some things you keep because the land remembers what you owe it, and what it cost, and who paid. For every grandfather who kept the old machine. For every farm that survived because someone remembered what couldn't be bought from a catalog. For every harvest that came in on the strength of work done quietly, years before it was needed.